The ayes have it. That concludes consideration of the Lord's message relating to the safety of Rwanda asylum and immigration bill.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Neale Hanvey.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this debate, the subject of this debate has been thrust into the spotlight in recent weeks. On the 4th of March, Michael Sallenberger's WPATH Files report by Mia Hughes was published, swiftly followed last week by Dr. Hilary Cass's eponymous report. Both make this clear. Gender identity and sex are completely different things, but ideological capture has blurred the lines. Early in the 90s, I was asked a question by a relative who was volunteering for the Samaritans, and she was speaking to a transvestite male who was struggling with his mental health, and did I, as a gay man, have any advice? And I was bemused by the question, because the only advice I could muster was that I had absolutely no insight whatsoever into cross-dressing behaviours, as most transvestites were heterosexual males. The notion that there is such a thing as an LGBT person is ludicrous. Homosexuality is an innate sexual orientation centred on one's natal sex. I am neither lesbian, bisexual or trans. I'm a gay male. Working with others who are same-sex attracted on shared LGBT rights has always made sense to me. As I've illustrated, there was a time in the not-too-distant past when heterosexual cross-dressers were confused with what it meant to be a gay male. There is little evidence of any T in the LGB. As they were then, what we now call gender identity and sex remain completely unconnected concepts, and they must not be confused. I started working in the NHS when I was 19 years old, and since then I have had a continuing responsibility for child safeguarding, which continues to this day. In 2019, I assumed that professional knowledge and academic experience would have been of value to my then political party, the SNP, as it attempted to grapple with gender recognition reform legislation. But I was wrong. I was an SNP candidate and the chair of Fife Pride back then, when I then met my then friend Shirley Ann Somerville for a coffee to discuss my safeguarding concerns over gender recognition reform. In addition to her Cabinet Secretary role, she was also covering the Equalities Brief. This was someone who I had known for years, someone who knew my family. I covered all the bases, emphasising exemplar cases like local sex offender Lennon Dolatowski, also known as Katie, who had been accused of sex offences in Miss Somerville's constituency and convicted of sexually assaulting a 10-year-old girl in the constituency, Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, which I was contesting. Despite assuring me throughout that conversation that she fully understood the concerns I raised, she concluded telling me in no uncertain terms, this was Nicola's priority, so I would have to keep my views to myself. In other words, I was being told to be silent on safeguarding. I told her that's not something I would be able to do. I couldn't be silent on the matter of safeguarding children. Soon after that meeting, the attacks from the gender radical wings of the SNP, the Greens, Labour and the Lib Dems began. Since 2019, and indeed before that, people who have had concerns about LGBT rights and safeguarding of children and young people have been systematically silenced, and not just by the SNP. As recognised by the Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, and again today in the Chamber by the Secretary of State for Health, there has been a deep-rooted capture within our institutions, with senior leaders ignoring the actual law and ideologically captured groups like Stonewall who misrepresent it. I will give way.
Can I commend Honourable Gentleman for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath for bringing this forward? And it is an issue we touched upon in a statement earlier on today. Does the Honourable Member not agree that we have a duty, I believe, to protect children of all backgrounds from the lobbying groups who abuse the system to promote a harmful ideology, and that multinational companies like Starbucks, as an example, who have supported charities such as Mermaids? It is time that these and those types of charities advocating for those as young as 14 years of old should rethink their charitable endeavours, and they should sow instead into charities that help protect our children, and they must be left alone to let kids be kids.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention, and I made this point earlier today during the statement, but the tentacles and influence of Stonewall need to be rooted out of every institution across these islands. It has been my long-held view that the agenda Stonewall have pushed has seen queer theory-based policies insinuate their way into every public body, into policing, education.
Order. We just have to go through the choreography, I'm afraid, because we've hit 10 o'clock. Can you move the agenda?
I beg to move this House to now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Please carry on.
I wonder why the mics were cutting out, Mr Deputy Speaker. So I'll go back a step. So Stonewall have pushed queer theory-based policies into every public body, including policing, education, health, and even onto the floor of the House of Commons, where straight women tell gay men to get back in their closet. The decision by Stonewall to add the T and incorporate cross-dressing heterosexual males under the wide banner of trans, or the more recently added Q+, was directly responsible for the elevation of concern amongst LGBT people, women and transsexuals. The damage done by Stonewall has been immeasurable. LGBT people, women, transsexuals have all been subjected to vitriolic attacks from queer theory activists who hide their vicious and vindictive mob behaviour behind hashtags like Be Kind. I could give a roll call of those who've stood up to this mob or been dragged through the media and the courts for vexatious purposes, but I would be on my feet all week. I also want to put it on record that the Labour Party leadership need to come out of hiding on this issue. The Shadow Health Secretary's recent Damascene moment of realisation doesn't mask the continued silence from the Leader of the Opposition or quell the ideological contingent of the Parliamentary Labour Party. That's not good enough in a general election year. People across these islands need to know this nightmare is coming to an end before they cast their votes. I'm encouraged by the emergence of sex, equality and equity networks known as SEANs across the public sector who now challenge this harmful ideological capture. Silence won't cut it. This indoctrination is causing very real and lasting damage. But the impact on those of us who spoke up has been nothing in comparison to the evil of medical malpractice visited on many vulnerable young people. Many of them were just lesbian, gay or bisexual, or young people dealing with trauma, mental health issues, neurodivergence and those in the care system. As Sex Matters, now a recognised human rights charity, have highlighted, and I quote, "A false global consensus around a gender-affirming approach has emerged because of ideological actors putting their individual belief systems ahead of the protection of distressed young people, many of whom are lesbian, gay and bisexual." The WPATH files shone a light on the lack of evidence to support so-called gender-affirming care and the ideological bias of documents masquerading as clinical standards. Tragically, for children in the UK, WPATH standards of care have been extremely influential in shaping NHS protocols since 2011. Young people and many others have been so badly failed. The Cass review must be the final nail in the coffin for gender-affirming model of care for gender-distressed children. Dr Cass builds on the concerns set out in the WPATH Files report, which lifted the lid on the culture inside the World Professional Association of Transgender Healthcare. The Cass report also criticises WPATH guidelines as lacking in evidence, developmental rigour, and emphasises the vital need for fully informed consent, especially for young people with mental health conditions or other diagnosable comorbidities. I would ask the Minister to discuss with colleagues in health to consider an urgent package of investment in child and adolescent mental health services as a starting point. That WPATH's unscientific standards of care guidelines have repeatedly been lauded by governments as international best practice is another issue of deep concern, and I ask the Minister if they will commit to look into the reasons why this was allowed to happen. Dr Cass dismisses any notion that puberty blockers or hormones have any part in standard treatment for under 18s. The report explicitly states that the medical pathway will not be right for most young people with gender distress, and I quote, "The focus on the use of puberty blockers for managing gender-related distress has overshadowed the possibility that other evidence-based treatments may be more effective. Clinicians have told us they are unable to determine with any certainty which children and young people will go on to have an enduring trans identity." She decisively refutes the idea that suicide prevention is a reason for medicalising gender distress in youth, saying it has been suggested that hormone treatment reduces the elevated risk of death by suicide in this population, but the evidence found did not support this conclusion. Gender distress has been treated within the NHS in a way that is different from other sorts of distress, to the detriment of vulnerable children. The CAS review definitively shows that young people with gender distress have been badly let down by those that claimed to be protecting them. It substantiates what so many, including Hannah Barnes and Helen Joyce, have argued, that gender-affirming care is not underpinned by a credible or developed evidence base. It leads to suboptimal outcomes and the diagnostic overshadowing of complex underlying health and social issues. Dr. Cass emphasises that there has been undue ideological influence on healthcare decision-making, specifically noting a suppression of evidence and a rush to medicalise vulnerable young people. This has been facilitated close to home in Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath constituency too. Carolyn Brown, a retired Deputy Principal Educational Psychologist for Fife Council, said in the Sunday Post this weekend, and I quote, "The same harmful ideologies identified in the Cash report have been happening across Scotland for years now, as senior officials in health, education and social work failed to listen to concerned voices and adopted the three wise monkeys attitude while vulnerable children were harmed. Many children going through puberty do question their gender, their identity and their bodies. That's just part of growing up. The danger comes when officials affirm those questionings and tell a child they can change their gender. This is ethically and morally irresponsible, as well as psychologically harmful, and more likely to compound the mental health issues the child already has and reinforce the child's self-perception that he or she is really trans. According to queer theory extremists, these children were born in the wrong body. Once again, I commend the bravery and strength of those who have detransitioned and have had the courage to tell their stories. Ciara Bell, Richie Herring, Sinead Watson, and also to those yet to find their voice. It's a double scandal that we do not know how many other young people have been affected and lives irreversibly altered by medical malpractice. These young people were exceptionalised and subject to life-altering treatments without due regard for safeguarding and denied the necessary follow-up expected in every other sphere of clinical practice. The cohort of GIDS patients were disproportionately made up of girls. Prior to the publication of CAS, Tavistock whistleblower Dr. David Bell spoke of young LGBT people, especially lesbians, having their sexuality transed away. Yet it's women's voices that have been sidelined the most, and no more so than the voice of lesbians. It won't have escaped the few people left in the chamber that I am not and never can be a lesbian. So I turn to lesbian activists in Scotland to give their perspective on the impact Stonewall's queer theory practices have had on their lives. These are their words. It has become very difficult to exclude men from lesbian spaces, especially if those spaces, events or groups are advertised publicly. Males are demanding access to lesbians for dating and to shame, bully or threaten lesbians who refuse. This has had the effect of driving lesbian culture underground, which means it's very difficult for young or isolated lesbians to make connections. They go on. Young lesbians tell us they are under a great deal of pressure to accept men in their spaces or as romantic partners. Some of the lesbians in the group have been pressured to identify as trans because of their same-sex attraction. The campaigns around gender ideology legislation has emboldened homophobes who make lesbians feel that there is something shameful or bigoted about our sexual orientation. Lesbians who assert their sexual boundaries are described as being obsessed with genitals or having a fetish or kink. This is undeniable and unacceptable homophobia. In Scotland, the Sandiford Clinic is continuing with these discredited hormone treatments, and to date the Scottish Government have persisted with the claims that this amounts to international best practice, a claim we now know to be manifestly false and worthless. As highlighted by the LGBT Alliance, Dr. Cass found that 89% of girls and 81% of boys referred to GIDS were ultimately not trans, but were either homosexual or bisexual. This indicates an alarming pattern of misdiagnosis and inappropriate, unnecessary and irreversible medical and surgical interventions, and confirms what many have feared, that the NHS GIDS adoption of gender affirmation as a model of care has led to them, whether inadvertent or not, practising medical and surgical gay conversion therapy. It is incoherent to put sexual orientation and gender identity under the same conversion therapy umbrella. Parliament should not legislate in this area until sound clinical evidence on the best model of care has been properly developed and validated. In a letter to First Minister Hanvey raising my concerns about so-called trans-inclusive conversion therapy, which we now know is gay conversion therapy, I made the following point. Legislating to compel belief in gender ideology runs counter to the provisions in the Equality Act 2010, put beyond doubt by the Maya Fostater and versus CGD Europe and others ruling. Forcing an ideology or belief on others would transform the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service into a pseudo-theocratic enforcement agency and would thus preclude any notion of receiving a fair trial. The Scottish Government, under Nicola Sturgeon and Hanvey have abandoned any pretence they are upholding their public sector equality duty, putting women, children and LGBT people at risk. They have been warned repeatedly. They called such concerns invalid and went ahead anyway. This place must not do the same. Both First Minister Hanvey and Ms Somerville have defended the introduction of non-statutory schools guidance, enabling non-expert teachers to affirm and enable so-called social transitioning of minors in absence of parental involvement or concern. But in a landmark legal opinion, human rights barrister Karen Monaghan concludes that schools and councils using such an approach are very likely to be in breach of equality and human rights legislation and at risk of being sued by excluded parents. And as my learned and honourable friend from Edinburgh South West noted recently, both the Equality Act 2010 and Human Rights Act 1998 are reserved matters, so the same risk of litigation should hold true in Scotland. There is little personal or professional protection for an activist teacher given this guidance is non-statutory, so the personal repercussions could be significant if they are pursued directly by excluded parents. All of these warnings were stated long before CAS was published, but the virulent opposition to reason fostered and facilitated by Stonewall's ideological capture across our public sphere has kept too many silent about the unfolding tragedy. Last week, I wrote to the Clerk of the House setting out in detail the legal and political incongruence and substantial risk of harm from ropey, ideologically driven legislation. Therefore, I am seeking confirmation from the Minister that any such legislation will be excluded from the up-and-coming Criminal Justice Bill, namely New Clause 37, given the weight of evidence Dr. Cass has published about the dangers of embedding such practice in statute. When I read the Cass report and contrast its findings with the meticulous follow-up so carefully developed and provided to the children and young people I cared for during their cancer journey, it makes me furious and ashamed that clinicians could ever behave in such a cavalier manner. The LGBT and other vulnerable young people who went to GIDS were subjected to life-altering treatments only to be cast aside without follow-up. This must never be allowed to happen again. It is unethical, unprofessional, and the damage inflicted frustratingly unknown. The evidence contained in the Cass report and the WPATH files is incontrovertible. In over 80% of cases, gender-affirming care is gay conversion therapy. Ending the routine prescribing of hormone-suppressing treatments is very much to be welcomed, but I wish to press the Minister further on the steps the Government will take to ensure that clinicians operating in private clinical practice and online pharmacies adhere to the NHS clinical guidelines issued by NHS England. This is a matter for health, justice and equalities to work in concert on. What further steps will the Government take to ensure that private clinics and online pharmacies are not able to circumvent these clinical guidelines, and what sanctions and enforcement measures will be put in place? And will the Minister also make it clear that never again will services for children and young people be exceptionalised in this way that they have been, and that Dr Cass's recommendations will be implemented in full, where healthcare, clinical practice and equalities will be based on evidence, the best interests of every child and young person and clinical expertise. And in closing, Mr Deputy Speaker, I agree with Dr Cass and that LGBT and gender non-conforming young people deserve very much better. But members of this House no longer have any excuse to look the other way or indeed to hide. Thank you very much.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I begin by thanking the honourable gentleman for securing this important debate. He's raised a number of very serious issues, and he will probably understand that a lot of these we are still considering. So I may not be able to go into too much detail right at this moment, but I would be more than happy to write to him and give him each of the progresses. Let me say as well at the beginning, I completely agree with him on, the need for us always to think about the safeguarding of children and young people, regardless of whether they're LGBT. We need to make sure that we have our obligations to that. And of course, there is much that we have seen in the Cass report that we welcome. This is a comprehensive report. And as my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, mentioned to the House earlier today, there's a lot that we'll be considering and responding to in due course. But I think much of what he is saying is that we need evidence-based decisions, and that is clearly going to be incredibly important. And I think also, I have mentioned at this dispatch box a number of times that sometimes this debate gets so toxic, and that doesn't help anybody. And there are strong views on all sides in this debate. But for me, what's really important is that we have that debate based on evidence, and that we actually make sure that we are careful in the way that we articulate our arguments, because there are people out there, particularly young people, who will listen to some of those words and will feel very affected and pressurised in whatever direction that may be. And that is why both myself and the Government, we are absolutely committed to improving the outcomes of young people, especially recognising that LGBT young people in particular can face very specific challenges. And they may include things like bullying at school, increased risk of mental health issues, as he alluded to, difficult family environments, and occasionally even homelessness as a result of their sexuality. And so I'd like to assure him that both myself and other Equality Hub ministers, we regularly engage with our counterparts across governments, departments on these really very important issues. And to help achieve the goal of improving the outcomes for LGBT people, we have ensured that spending for children and young people on their mental health service has increased. He was right to raise that. I think it is important. We've increased that from £841 million in 1920 to just over £1 billion. But I will ensure that I write to my colleagues in the Department for Health and Social Care, raising the points that he's raised with me this evening. I'll give way.
Or the intervention. He's really raised something that is extremely important to me around the support of mental health care for young people, and particularly child and adolescent mental health services. And I would reflect back on the statement this afternoon from the Secretary of State for Health, and some of the comments that came from the opposition benches, which were decrying the long waiting lists for good services. I would just like to make this point, and I hope you will agree with me, that those waiting lists, given the attrition rate of upwards of 80%, where young people who waited a long time actually worked out that they were just lesbian, gay or bisexual, and they didn't go through and complete the surgical medical treatments. Does he not agree that those long waiting lists may have saved some young people from the harm that's been inflicted on others, and that really the focus now needs to be on CAMS funding to make sure that young people get the mental health support before they make irreversible, irrevocable decisions?
And I think this is exactly why the CAS report has been so important, because it's been a very carefully considered report, and of course we've got to take time now to consider that for the government response. But he is right that when young people are, if you like, deciding to come out, or are understanding that their sexuality may be lesbian or gay, they should have the support that they need to do that. And we recognise that for some, they may not have the family support that I was fortunate enough to enjoy. I'm blessed to have an amazing family who were very supportive of me, but I do recognise that for many others that isn't the case. And so he has raised some important points, and as I committed to a moment ago, I will ensure that I write to my colleagues within the Department for Health to raise the questions that he raises. I think it's also important to point out that we do work in partnership with the Department for Education as well, because it's really important that we make sure that there's plenty of work going on the anti-bullying side of things. And he alluded to some of the pressures that people he has spoken to have felt. And that is why we have allocated a further £3 million of funding that's divided between 5 anti-bullying organisations to tackle bullying in school, but also that is on top of the £4 million that's already been spent in this area since 2016. And this does include projects that specifically target anti-LGBT hate-related bullying. And in October of 22, we launched a victim support service for anyone affected by or at risk of conversion practices, regardless of the sexual orientation, sex or transgender identity. And the helpline is there to provide support and information to anyone over the age of 13. And as I've said on many occasions, conversion practices are not a one-way street. Conversion practices, changing somebody from what they believe they are to something else, in my view, is abhorrent and is clearly wrong. And that, as I say, it can go either way. So it's really important that we do acknowledge that. The other area that we've done a lot of work with is on the issue of homelessness, because I've seen so many instances where young people, finding themselves in these challenging areas, end up, because of that lack of perhaps family support or because of the mental health issues, end themselves in a homelessness situation. And so that's why last year both myself and the Minister for Homelessness, we convened a round table for local authorities and for charitable organisations to ensure that we are trying to do a very tailored support for those people who are LGBT, and we do take those issues incredibly seriously. I also want to point out, he mentioned the issues in Scotland. Well, of course, it wouldn't be responsible for me to answer on behalf of the Scottish Government. I don't want to do that. But in terms of what we're doing here, of course, we want to ensure that children are prepared for life in modern Britain, and they need to understand the world in which they're growing up in. And that's why the statutory guidance states that all pupils should receive teaching on LGBT contact during their school years, both and in secondary schools. I can see he wants me to give way, so I'm happy to do so.
It's a good sport. as always. Just to clarify on the issue with Scotland, I think the fundamental question is about the implementation and observation of the responsibilities within the Equality Act and upholding the Human Rights Act, which are both reserved matters, and particularly the public sector equality duty, which has been an issue across a whole range of public bodies, and not least the Scottish Government, who seem to have their own, perhaps stonewall view of how that should be interpreted. And I think it's really incumbent on all of us to refocus on the fundamental principles contained within that duty.
Absolutely right to raise the issues of the Equality Act, and you know, I'm again happy to, because it can get quite complex, and I would be terrified of saying the wrong words at the dispatch box. But if he will allow me, I will write to him with a few more details on those important points. And I was talking about the processes within the statutory guidance. Of course, our colleagues in the Department for Education is currently reviewing the statutory guidance that we have, and we expect that to go out to public consultation later this year. The review has been informed by independent expert panel, which brought together input from health, curriculum and safeguarding. So we hope that that will be a good piece of work that will provide updates on the guidance there. With regard to gender questioning students' guidance, as he will be aware, the Department for Education published a comprehensive draft guidance for teachers on how best to support pupils and questioning their gender in schools. Parents, teachers and school leaders were encouraged to respond to that 12-week consultation, which closed on the 12th of March. A range of views will be considered, and I look forward to the publication of the consultation response as we continue to work in this sensitive area. But it is important that we get that absolutely right, and that parents are obviously involved in that. That's incredibly important. I feel like I haven't given him a million answers at this stage, but I hope he will understand that we've just had the report from CAS. It's important we take time to consider that. We are going through the review of the guidances that I mentioned, and it's important that we have those proper processes taking place. But on the other issues that he's raised, as I've committed to, I will write to my colleagues within the Department for Health, and I will update him when I've had a response from them. And in the meantime, can I thank him for bringing this important area of work. I think my view is that we all want to help people live their lives as they wish, without prejudice or without pressure. And I think there is a responsibility on all of us in this House to do that in a way that is humane and is compassionate. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to outline what we're doing as a government to support that.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. May I let me say aye?
Aye.
As we know, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.
Has ended. The proceeding 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 has ended.